Welcome to the world of CDR Beer Lab, the fast and easy-to-use analysis system designed for breweries of all sizes. With CDR Beer Lab, you can monitor in real time the quality of your beer, from the grain to the finished product, analyzing parameters like bitterness, color, alcohol content, and much more, all directly in your brewery. No more waiting for lab results. As the Brewfeast brewery claims, with CDR Beer Lab, the immediate benefit was undoubtedly the speed of execution in the various analyses that we undertake here in-house in the internal laboratory. Simple, accurate, and fast. With CDR Beer Lab, controlling every stage of production is within everyone's reach. Let's discover how to enhance your beer with a professional tool and immediate results.
Hey everybody, welcome to Options Non-Beer Beverage Programs for Breweries. My name is Aaron Gore, but for some of you who I have not been fortunate enough to meet yet, I'm sure that you're asking yourself, who the hell is this guy? And frankly, why should I care? Fair questions all around, but thankfully for me and luckily for you, I've got a slide for that. Again, my name is Aaron Gore. I'm the Director of Partnerships and Community for Arryved, a software solutions company focused entirely on the craft beverage industry, but I've been in the adult beverage industry almost my entire adult life, starting out in sales and marketing before moving forward onto operations and then full-time as a consultant for 6 years, working with nearly 70 breweries on more than 3 continents, but not just breweries, also cideries and meaderies, spirits companies, some wineries, and even plenty of independent bars and restaurants, including ones that I have run myself. And one thing that I've noticed time and time again about people in the beer industry is that they're very, very comfortable when it comes to beer, which frankly makes complete sense. I mean, after all, at the end of the day, this is what you got into this business to do, and this is the focus of our industry. But one area that they're not as familiar with or as comfortable with is going to be all the alcoholic beverages out there that are not beer. I can understand what's going through some people's heads, why can't we just stick to beer? As a matter of fact, that is why I'm doing this. So why can't beer remain our focus? And it's a fair question and one that deserves to be answered. So let's go ahead and tackle that. Why are non-beer options important? Well, first and foremost is that if I were to go, for example, to any dive bar here in the Charlotte, North Carolina area where I live, or wherever you happen to be, Jackson Hole, Wyoming, there's a solid chance that if I go in that dive bar, they're going to have 1, maybe 2, 3, maybe even 4 or 5 craft beer options. Guys, in 2024, it's pretty easy to get your hands on good beer. And if the mission of our industry was to make it easier for people to get good beer, then congratulations, we did it. We won. Doesn't always feel like winning, but that part of our mandate, that's been fulfilled. And that means that our tap rooms have to evolve alongside that same landscape. We cannot stand on "if you brew it, they will come" as a differentiator. It was never really true. It surely is not today. So we have to become full, dedicated hospitality businesses. But still, the question remains, why not just beer? Well, it's not just the industry that's changed. It's also been our customers. They've evolved alongside that industry, and more our customers are omnibulous. It's just a really pretentious way of saying that they drink across categories. They drink everything. When I do this talk live, one of the fun things that I like to do is have everybody put their hands up if they drink beer. And obviously at a brewer's conference or workshop, everybody does. And I say, well, put your hand down if you drink anything other than just beer. And every hand goes down. We are the problem, but we are also the opportunity. Our customers want more than just beer, depending on how they're feeling, depending on the day, depending on the use occasion, depending on the meal, depending on the company. Those things change, those things evolved. And if we want to be able to meet them where they're at and be able to serve their needs, then we need to be able to have more than just beer, even within our own tap rooms and tasting rooms. And it also helps to exclude certain customers. If you have a group of 7 people come in the door and one of them only drinks wine, doesn't drink beer at all, then you haven't lost one customer. You've lost all 7, unless their friends really suck. So it's important to be able to not exclude customers, not even just for that customer's sake, but for the fact that these people tend to move as groups, and they tend to have friend groups. And whether it's word of mouth or whether it's them literally just wanting to go and grab a pint together, the more options you have, the more opportunities you open up for that to happen in your space. And if you're running any sort of private events program, which has increasingly become a primary source of revenue in some cases for a lot of breweries, you really do need more than just beer, because if someone is going to have a bridal shower or a celebration of life, they're going to want at the very least wine, and even better if you have spirits. These are things that you have to understand, and just being able to have those options available, that's nice, but being able to understand them and treat them with the same level of respect and dignity that you do your beer is also critical, because as far as your customers are concerned, that service, that knowledge, the reason it is important for your own beer is the same reason it's just as important for anything that you're carrying as a product. And your team needs to be educated, and you as an owner or an operator need to be educated as well, because that can also open up entire areas of your business that aren't necessarily that profitable right now. Spirits, for example, hang on longer in the day when it comes to sales than does beer. Beer starts to cap out around 10 p.m. on average, whereas spirits tend to cap out around 1 a.m. You have a 3-hour window where spirits become increasingly important. Coffee, for example, opens up entire parts of the day you might not even be open right now. And it's not just time of day, it's incremental revenue. If someone is feeling like having a nice glass of Chardonnay, then they are not probably going to switch over to a nice glass of IPA, and vice versa. Being able to accommodate those different use occasions isn't about having them trade down to a less ideal option. It's about them deciding to trade up to a better suited establishment. So when you have those cross category sales, it's almost entirely incremental to your business. And I think we can all agree we could use some additional business right now. It's also a beautiful thing because most of those other beverage categories have a longer shelf life than beer. So your risk, your inventory risk is also lower. But let's talk about what types of non-beer beverages there are. And I'm going to move extremely fast because we got an enormous amount of cover. So today we're going to be talking predominantly about wine, cider, and spirits, but there are RTDs, some more niche fermented and distilled products, as well as coffee and tea. But let's go ahead and dive in first on wine, which is probably the one with which most beer people are least familiar, even though it is the one that has in some ways the most in common, because wine is a beverage that dates back to antiquity, just like beer is. And historically, there was a divide between places where wine was predominant and places where beer was predominant. But these days, even though it is only a fraction of the size of the beer market, wine does carry an enormous amount of cultural cachet, and more than any other beverage tends to have relatively dedicated drinkers that you're able to capture by having it as an option. But there's myriad options. So let's talk a little about what wine is. Now, we know on the beer side, you malt barley, steep it in water to convert the starches into sugars, boil it, add hops, add yeast, ferment it, and that makes beer. Well, with wine, you don't have to process it nearly as much. There's a famous saying that goes that great beer is made, great wine is grown. And that's not to cast aspersions on the fantastic winemakers out there, or cast aspersions on the people growing barley and hops. Is merely to say that beer is much more of a manufactured product, while wine is much more of an agricultural product, because you don't have to do much to it. If you have a whole big vat of grape juice that you do nothing to, it will on its own turn into wine. The trick is making it turn into wine that's actually nice to drink. And that's where the actual hand of the winemaker comes in. But typical ABV is significantly higher than beer. You're talking about between 11 and 16%. There are wines like Moscato d'Asti that can get down to around 3.5%. And there's fortified wines, things like port, things like vermouth that can get on the higher side. But, typically is going to be somewhere within that range. Can also range from dry to sweets. These days, dry wine is very popular, but sweeter wines were more popular historically, and that's bounced around a little bit. But in general, like with most beer, something on the drier side is definitely going to be more common. It's 4 primary categories. We'll dive into them in a little more detail here in a second. Red, white, most of us are familiar with those, rosé, and then sparkling wine, which is generally treated as its own category. But outside of those, you do have a handful of smaller categories that aren't as huge a component of total wine, but are still important to know. Those will be things like brandy, which is just distilled wine. That's all that means. Cognac and Armagnac are just types of brandy. Hennessy, just a type of cognac, which is a type of brandy. It's just distilled wine. In the same way that whiskey is distilled beer. Dessert wines, These are largely going to be ones that are either picked when they have extremely high sugar content or have had some sort of process done to them or allowed to happen, whether certain types of mold that can cause this or freezing them on the vine. But the goal is to drive up that sugar content to make them extremely sweet. So these are ones that you will drink independently or alongside your dessert. They tend to be very high sweetness, very high acidity, and are unlike anything else in the wine category. Vermouth or aromatized wine, which is just wine that has had a neutral spirit, usually a neutral brandy added to it to seize the fermentation. And then botanicals added for vermouth. It needs to be wormwood, but there are some other related aromatic wines that have other botanicals and lack the wormwood. Amber orange wine. Now, amber and orange wine are made from actual white wine grapes, but you let them sit on the skins. And what that does is over time extracts some of the color from the skins and gives them this beautiful copper color. They also tend to have relatively low acidity, can be a little on that funky side. If you're familiar with Brett beer, some of those same things can come into play, a little peppery as well. And these are actually, in a lot of ways, the original wines. We've known about these from the areas of Georgia and Armenia and Slovenia for a very, very long time, but they've only really started to become more popular and these days are actually trendy here in the last couple of years. So you may see those pop up more and more, and then natural and biodynamic wines. Now, natural wine, this just means that think of this as minimal intervention. So the grape grower is doing as little to affect those grapes as possible outside of the same sort of things you could do in a more organic setting. So no pesticides, trying to avoid really doing anything other than letting those grapes grow and sing. And they do the same thing in the winemaking process. So minimal or no additions of sulfites. Sulfites are something that you use to prevent bacterial infection or wild yeast infection of the wine. Same reason that we use hops in beer. And just really trying to let the grapes convert themselves and speak to themselves. Typically no bought-in yeast, typically using yeast that grows right on the grapes. Think of that almost like a spontaneous fermentation. Whereas biodynamic is that, but one step further. Biodynamic is an entire philosophy built around the phases of the moon and certain days, only certain activities can happen. And here's the thing about biodynamic wine, the entire thing is absolute bullshit. It's nonsense. It is absolute homeopathic BS. But here's the funny thing about it. Most biodynamic wines are actually extremely high quality. And the reason for that is regardless of whether or not these are actual processes that do anything over the course of the winemaking process, when you have a winemaker and a grape grower that are this incredibly tightly focused on making sure that they are putting as much intentionality into their product as possible, it does tend to lead to very good wine. So if you see biodynamic, yes, there's a lot of astrology levels of nonsense behind it, but that's not what's really important. What's important is the wine will typically be very good. But let's talk a bit about some of the wine styles that are out there because beer comes in pretty well codified styles. It's something we love to do is draw up BJCP guidelines and tell people what is and is not the platonic ideal of a certain style. That doesn't really happen in wine because wine is far more driven by a couple of things. The first is where it is grown. That's a terroir, if you've ever heard that term. It just means, it technically translates as dirt, but it's really that je ne sais quoi, that absolutely irreplicable quality of where something is grown. And that also tends to come with certain types of blends or winemaking styles that are pretty particular to a region. But the other one is going to be grape varietal. Now, if you're familiar with hop varieties, things like Mosaic, things like Citra, things like Nelson Sauvin, it's very similar. So you have more than 1,000 of these grape varietals, all of which contribute an enormous range of different flavors, aromas, colors, tannins, which is going to be at drying, astringent, almost like a sandpaper or your cat's paw kind of, or cat's tongue rather, kind of sensation when you're drinking it, dries out your mouth. Think of that almost the same way you think of bitterness from hops and beer. But we don't need to memorize all of those. Similarly, like when I'm teaching wine people about the beer side of things, which I just did a week ago in SomCon in San Diego. For wine, we're going to go ahead and drop these into buckets. So we're going to break these down a little bit and I'll describe some of what you can expect. So the first thing you're going to see are these big, bold, tannic reds. Again, tannin just means it's going to have that drying astringency. It's going to dry your mouth out a bit, and that adds texture. That's a cutting component. And These are the imperial stouts of the wine world. These kick you in the teeth. They're aggressive. They are big and bold, and they command your attention. They don't ask for it. And these will be things like Cabernet Sauvignon, which I'm sure most people are familiar with. It's the number one most planted grape in the world. Syrah or Shiraz. These are the exact same grape. Syrah is the original name. If it's grown in Australia, a lot of times they call it Shiraz. That's a whole rabbit hole we could get down into. Malbec, which is most often associated with Argentina these days. Tempranillo, which is most often associated with Rioja in Spain. It's a very common grape grown there. And one important thing about grapes is most of these more popular international styles you'll be able to find almost anywhere. And there's a lot of wine grapes that are going to be parts of these buckets that I'm not going to mention here today, but keep in mind some of the ones that I am mentioning here because they're also going to be some of the ones that you'll be most likely to see out and about. And in general, when it comes to any of these beverages we're talking about that are not beer, stick to things that people are more familiar with so that you have less of an education gap, since that isn't necessarily your focus. So next up are going to be those lighter, more delicate reds. These are going to be ones that are very food friendly, but at the same time still have enough body to them that they're showing up, but light enough, and they could be easily overpowered if you're not giving them the space that they need to breathe. So think of these almost more like an amber ale. They're not going to be real light. They're not going to be real spritzy, but they're going to take well to what you pair them with and have enormous versatility. And even on their own, they have such a balance of not too far in any direction that they're fantastic to look up and fantastic to explore on their own merits. And these will typically have things like red berry notes, raspberry, strawberry, red cranberry, as well as sometimes you'll get hints of forest floor or mushroom that you don't necessarily get out of a lot of other styles. Pinot Noir is by far the most well-known of these, but there's a handful of them out there, and some of the ones from lesser known regions are also becoming more well known. If you ever hear the term Burgundy, that's a wine growing region in France, of which Pinot Noir is its most well known and well regarded style of wine. Then you have the ones that are somewhere in the middle. These are going to be kind of medium bodied red wines. And these ones tend to be very, very food friendly. So these are going to be the kind that go well with, for example, Italian food. Tomatoes are notoriously difficult to pair wine with. They just have that combination of umami and acid and sweet that seems like it can just get overpowered or overpower almost anything. Well, these are ones that are really your pasta wines. These are the ones that are meant for those things that have a little more going on, but they're just going to take to them naturally and round out all the rough edges. And this is going to be ones like Sangiovese. If you've ever heard Chianti, is made with Sangiovese, and this is Italian wine. So you can see where I'm going with this. If you've ever seen the old wide bottles with the wicker around the bottom, those are typically going to be Chianti Classico. Cab Franc, which tends to have like bell pepper, almost green coffee notes to it. This is typically from the west of France, but you also find it in Virginia. It actually grows a decent amount of Cab Franc, and it's a component in Bordeaux blends, so alongside Cabernet Sauvignon and Merlot. You have things like Grenache from the southeast of Italy, and Zinfandel, not white Zin. We'll get to that in a minute, but Zinfandel is a bold, extremely fruit-forward, juicy, jammy, almost style of wine that is very distinctly American as well. Was one of the first grapes that really became an American staple out in California and almost went away. Again, we'll get to that in a second, but Zinfandel is about as distinctly American a style as you're going to find. But that's just the red side. We also have the white side of wine, and let's start with the full-bodied white. So these are going to be the ones that are going to not be super sprightly and super bright. These ones are going to have a little more substance to them. Think of these almost more like a Maybach. That's California Chardonnay is one that a lot of people are familiar with. Chardonnay, very, very popular grape grown on almost every wine growing region in the world, but Chardonnay is a bit of a chameleon, takes on very different qualities depending on where you grow it. And for California Chardonnay, for a long time, that was associated with those buttery diacetyl laden, it's the exact same compound, diacetyl laden, heavily oaked Chardonnays, so hints of vanilla, hints of coconut, and butter, butterscotch, toffee, and that style was one that did exist for quite a while, but has since actually largely disappeared, or at least tamped down outside of ones that are intentionally going for that for its fans. A lot of Chardonnay is going to be a little more moderate and then a little more balanced, but still have substance of body to it. White Burgundy is also made of Chardonnay, and from that same Burgundy region as Pinot Noir is typically from. Then the light bright whites, these are going to be your Berliner Weisses. These are going to be your American Pilsners, your Japanese Pilsners. These are going to be the ones that are poolside, easy drinkers, patio drinking wines. Now, New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc is all grapefruit and grass and petrol and gooseberry, and that's a hugely popular one right now. My mother-in-law drinks more New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc than you'd believe, but there's other styles that are going to be hitting that from different angles. Some are more lime forward or lemon zest. Some are going to be a lot more peach and stone fruit and floral. But some of the other ones to keep an eye out for are going to be Vinho Verde, Albarino from Spain, Vinho Verdes from Portugal. Pinot Grigio and Pinot Gris, those are the exact same grape. Typically, Italian varieties or ones done in the Italian style are called Pinot Grigio, and ones done more in the Alsatian, French-German style are going to be called Pinot Gris. But those ones are going to be very bright. They were super popular back in the day, faded a bit, but very stone fruit and floral. Also very food friendly if you get the right ones, especially the ones that aren't so sweet and have a little complexity to them. And then the aromatic whites. So if you have any friends who are sommeliers, I guarantee you this is going to be one of their favorite categories of wine, period. These are going to be ones that, well, let's talk about most wine. Most wine, the aromas don't jump out of the glass the same way that beer does. And the reason for that is wine, by and large, outside of a handful of styles, doesn't have carbonation. It's not carrying those volatiles up to your nose in the same way that beer does. So you're not going to smell it from across the room the same way you would an oversaturated hazy IPA, for example. Aromatic whites are different. They have a lot of aromas that are very volatile and will aromatize right out of the glass for you. And that makes them extremely food friendly. That makes them extremely complex. They tend to be high acid, especially in the case of Riesling. So some age surprisingly well for a light white wine. And these are very, very easy to drink, but also very, very complex and fun to drink. And Riesling is by far the most famous. It can range from sweet to dry. Sometimes it can be a nightmare to figure out which is which, but in general, any Riesling is going to pair well with spicy food. It's going to pair well with these complex flavors that might otherwise just absolutely drown out what's going on in a wine, and Somms love them. Rosés, a few different ways of making rosé. So one of the ways that you can make it is to just let the juice sit with the skins of red wine grapes. Rosé is made typically from red wine grapes. Let it sit with those skins for a while and then drain it off before it's really gotten more than just a nice pink tone to it. You can also blend in a little bit of red wine or red wine must juice if you want to, but typically letting it steep with some of those skins for a while is the most traditional and generally the highest quality method. And the main real styles there, the first is Provence, which is the style that has really taken the world by storm in the last few years from the south of France. And these are very dry and very bright, tend to be a very light salmon into pale pink color. And, you're getting watermelon and cranberry, maybe some strawberry out of them. Beautiful wines that just really call to spring, call to summer. The other side is White Zinfandel. So White Zinfandel is actually made from red Zinfandel grapes and was actually created as an experiment in the barrel aging of a white Zin that wasn't supposed to sit on the skins at all, with the idea being to just go ahead and drain it right off there and throw it in barrels and see what would happen, and instead made this beautiful pink colored wine that also tended to be naturally sweet. The fermentation stopped itself and made something that had not really been seen before by most wine drinkers. And this took the world by storm. This wound up being one of the biggest hits wine, especially American wine, has ever had. And generally, these wines are not very complex. They're not very good. And they've kind of fallen off the face of the planet, even though you still find them from time to time. But what's really important about White Zin is that it helps save a lot of old, in some cases 100, 150, 200-year-old vines of Zinfandel in California that to this day are now in a lot of cases being used for more traditional red Zin, which is fantastic. And then you have sparkling wines. These are going to be things like champagne. Everybody's heard of champagne, protected designation from France, and champagne does tend to be more expensive, and is actually re-fermented in the bottle. That's where the bubbles come from. It's called traditional method, and tends to pick up these biscuity, almost brioche notes from the dead yeast in there. Same as if you have an older bottle fermented beer. But beyond champagne, there's a whole wide world of sparkling wine that doesn't get explored that often. Prosecco being pretty well known. Prosecco tends to be a little lighter than champagne and a lot lighter on your budget as well in most cases. And Prosecco is also not necessarily lower quality. It's made in a different method. They go ahead and actually add the carbonation by doing that similar process to what's happening in a champagne bottle, but all in one large vat. But in general, the Prosecco, when you get a range of either relatively cheap all the way through some very high end that are still relatively cheap for what they are, but the quality is still remarkable. And they tend to be a little brighter, tend to be a little more floral than you're getting out of champagne. But that's not where it is. So you have Cava from southeast Spain, or I guess technically East Spain, depending on how you're orienting yourself. And Cava is made in the same method as champagne, but a lot of times you'll be able to get that at a fraction of a price. And these days is actually fairly trendy for exactly that reason. It will have quality that is the similar or better quality than average champagne. Maybe not the same dizzying heights of the best champagne, but very, very high quality, high standards, but also going to be doing it at a relative steel. Cremant is also that is going to be sparkling wine from other parts of France that are not champagne, and some of those have similar histories that age back almost as long and are turning out quality very similar to champagne. And those also tend to go for relatively cheap when you're able to find them stateside. Those are a little more difficult to find. American sparkling wines, there's a handful, very small handful of firms here in the U.S. that are allowed to still call their sparkling wine champagne. That dates back to an agreement between the U.S. and France over use of that term. They were grandfathered in. But in general, American wineries making sparkling wine will just call it American sparkling wine. And American sparkling wine ranges all the way from borderline garbage that you can just dump in the sink and probably be a better use for it, all the way to stuff that would challenge the finest champagnes and the finest cavas when it comes to quality. So that one can be a little confusing. You might not necessarily know what you're getting, but pay attention to some of the ratings, pay attention to what people are saying, because there really are some great finds out there. Franciacorta is going to be the same thing for Italy that Cremant and Cava are for France and Spain. So traditional sparkling wine from that country, and English sparkling wine is also becoming a lot more common. They can grow grapes in England, not super well, and it's not a hugely profitable business, but the quality of English sparkling wine has become pretty notable, especially in the last decade or so. Something to keep an eye on for the future. But let's take a look at time. When you're building a wine program, glassware. Not nearly as many glassware options as you're going to have to worry about with beer. Usually a universal or an ISO, that just means the international standards glass, are going to be the great start. So these ones they're typically what we would think of as a white wine glass these days, pretty standard size. If you're ever have in your head just a generic wine glass, that's what we're talking about with a universal wine glass, and they're intended to be universal. They might not be as ideal as every specific type of wine glass is for every specific style of wine, but they'll do a trick for almost anything. And in general, you're going to want to stick with popular varietals. Don't try to get too crazy with a single varietal Roussanne that no one has any idea what it's going to taste like or knows what to expect. Stick to ones from that list, because you don't want to have the burden of education. You just want to have the burden of service. And that's really where you can put your focus when you stick with things that customers are at least going to be familiar with. And now it's your job to explain to them why this particular one is worth their time, and make sure that they have the best time at your establishment that they can. And that really extends to blends as well. So, even though we're typically familiar with having a lot of wines, most wines as single varietals, one variety of grape, there's nothing that restricts anyone from blending, at least not outside of certain appellations. And there are a lot of blends that are extremely high quality and extremely fantastic, just like there are with Scotch blends. But that's going to take a lot more education to explain what that blend is going to taste like, because customers do have certain expectations of certain varieties that they understand, but not usually for blends. So be careful with those. Make sure it's something that your bartenders are prepared to explain when customers are shopping around your wine. It's also important to mind your budget very carefully, because unlike beer, which has a relatively constrained range of prices, I know it seems like Some of those hype beers are going, $20 or more a 4-pack. But think about the difference between $2 Chuck and a wine that sells for $1,500 a bottle. That is a much, much bigger range, even just at the grocery store, than you're getting out of all of the beer category put together. So it's very easy to blow your budget. Start with what you can afford to spend. There's going to be at least acceptable options at most price points. Now, by the glass, selling wine where you pour it as individual servings out of the bottle into a glass, that should and will always be your highest margin product. It should be your highest selling as well. Most people coming to your space aren't necessarily looking to get an entire bottle, and that's okay because you need to be setting those margins high enough to offset the risk that if you don't pour every ounce of wine that's in that bottle and it winds up sitting on the shelf too long and the quality goes down, you should be comfortable dumping it because you've already made your value off of it. So in general, that by the glass price for an individual glass should be somewhere between 85 and 100% of the wholesale price of that bottle, what you paid for. That way, just by opening it up, just by selling that one glass, you're at least going to come pretty damn close to covering your costs and making sure that you're not eating the cost of that bottle just because only one person happened to want to buy that in a given week. Bottles should also be priced if people are going to be buying the whole bottle between 2 to 3 times that wholesale cost. So you're talking decent margins on that. And, a lot of places will also do what's called a corkage fee, where if people are going to be opening a bottle on site, whether they bring it themselves in some cases, that's legally allowed, or in most cases, buying a full bottle and opening on site, there will typically be a corkage fee as well, a small fee just for the privilege of doing so, again, to offset the fact that they're not going to be buying that by the glass wine that's really going to be your moneymaker. And in general, pours for wine, don't under pour, but don't feel like you got to pour that thing almost up to the top like you do with the beer. For one, that's reckless and it's a liability concern, but also 5-ounce pours are the standard for by the glass, and people are very familiar and comfortable with that. And no one's going to pipe up if you only give them a 5-ounce pour. That's what wine should be served as. And make sure that you're recorking those bottles between use, or using a vacuum sealer. The little stopper that goes on top comes with a pump. You do that, helps it last maybe a day or two longer. But the important thing there is you're marking the date on the bottle, and after a couple of days for white wine, after maybe 5 days for red wine, go ahead and dump the rest of the bottle if there is any remaining, because you don't want to be serving an inferior product. That's not good, whether it's your beer or a wine that you bought in from elsewhere. Customers will remember that, not necessarily where it came from. But now diving into cider, moving forward. We've got to breeze through this one relatively quick because it's a smaller segment of the market. Cider is to apples what wine is to grapes. So it's just fermented apple juice. And just in the same way, if you let grape juice just sit out, it'll turn into wine. If you just let apple juice sit out, it'll turn into cider. But there's a couple of key differences. First, the typical ABV is going to be much more similar to beer, typically between 3 and 8%, though there are some varieties that go higher. And even though a lot more often here in the States, customers are acclimated to relatively sweet or off-dry ciders as opposed to dry wines, they can range all the way from bone dry all the way up to very, very sweet. And as opposed to being merely varietal focused, there's typically 5 regions that we talk about when we're talking about cider. And that's going to be the UK, it's going to be France, in particular, Normandy and Brittany, which are going to be along the top coast of France. Spain, in which case we're mostly talking about Asturias and the Basque Country, again on the top coast, especially north and northeast of Spain. America, and particularly US and Canada, and then Central Europe on a much smaller scale, in which case that's going to be Germany and Austria, so southern Germany and Austria. And there's some other categories as well that fall under kind of this general cider heading. First is Calvados, and Calvados is just apple brandy. So it's distilled apple. It's distilled cider in the same way that brandy is distilled wine. And Calvados, just like cognac or Armagnac, are appellations, designated types of brandy. Calvados is a designated type of apple brandy from certain regions of Normandy along the north coast of France. And, Calvados is absolutely spectacular when it's well made. Is an incredibly versatile spirit. Has those beautiful apple notes and some baking spices, even some nuttiness that you're not going to get of a lot of other things while still having a nice clean bite and being versatile enough to be blended and mixed well into mixed drinks. But we'll get into that in a bit. Applejack just being an American take on Calvados that exists back to colonial times. Ice cider happens when you allow apples to actually freeze on the branches of the tree in places that have really cold winters. You get some late harvested varieties of apples that hang on a long time. You let them freeze there. And what that does is actually creates ice crystals that extracts the water and separates it from the sugar and the rest of what is in that apple. So that when you crush it, you get an extremely highly sugary liquid and then ferment that into these beautiful, almost unctuous, incredibly sweet, incredibly acidic dessert ciders that and there is ice wine, which is done a similar fashion with grapes, but ice cider has become a specialty of Quebec. You can now find it across Canada and in a handful of places in the US. And if you ever get an opportunity, they are truly, truly delicious and truly special. And then pommos. Pommos, when you take apple juice and then you add the equivalent of Calvados to it to go ahead and fortify its alcohol content, which also keeps it from fermenting. There's something similar you can do with grapes. It's called a mistel, but Pommeau is a bit of a specialty in some places in Normandy and in Brittany, and is absolutely fantastic. Very hard to find anywhere, even in its country of origin. But Pommeaus, when you do get them, they have all of the bright, juicy appliness of fresh apple juice, but also all the complexity that you're going to get out of a fermented and distilled spirit, as well as that bite, that backbone that really helps round everything out to something that's truly impossible to replicate in any other kind of beverage. Now, talking a little about apples, just like there's varieties of hops, varieties of grapes, you have varieties of cider apples. They tend to fall into 4 categories: sweet, which are low in acidity and low in tannins. It doesn't necessarily mean they have a huge amount of sugar, but just means very low acidity, low tannins. Sharps are going to be high acidity, low tannins. Bitter sweets, high tannins, low acidity. Bitter sharps, high acidity, high tannins. Pretty straightforward. And most of the apples that you find at the grocery store, those would qualify as being sweets or sharps if you were to drop them into this system. And you can make cider out of them, and a lot of them across the world are made out of those more culinary or cooking apples. But there are also dedicated cider apples that are not pleasant to eat at all. They actually call them spitters because if you bit into them, they'd be so astringent or so acidic, they just wouldn't be a pleasant experience whatsoever. But when you juice them and ferment them, it creates more than the sum of the parts. It creates something absolutely deeply complex and incredible and beautiful. And the best ciders in the world are typically going to be made from at least a portion of those dedicated cider apple varieties. There's even more cider apple varieties, even more apple varieties rather, than there are grape varieties. Apples love to mutate. Every time you plant a seed, it will not resemble its parent necessarily at all. They're deeply complex genetic organisms, and they are wild with the way that they grow and show off new features. So let's talk a bit, though, about the different types of cider and breeze through that. So in the UK, we typically have 1 of 2 types. You have Eastern styles that come from south of London and in that neck of the woods, and those are going to be largely made from culinary apples. They tend to be very light, easy drinking, not too complex, but very refreshing. Perfect if you're hanging out poolside or hanging out on your lawnmower, just mowing the lawn. And then you have West Country, which are the ones from the 4 counties, so due west on near the coast of the country, up near Wales, and those are going to be made almost exclusively from bitter sharp and bitter sweet apples. So those dedicated cider apples, and those ones are going to typically be bone dry, no residual sugar or very little residual sugar, and they're going to have deep complexity, but also occasionally even a hint of funk to them, almost a barnyardiness that would be more familiar from something that was done with Brett, though usually not quite that expressive. And the flavor range can be huge. Apples can express so many different flavors. So you can have everything from citrus to stone fruit to fresh flowers to honey, all the way into baking spices and even herbaceousness, a green note, sometimes even hints of tarragon or anise. So, just because they are going to be made from cider apples and they're going to be bone dry and have that in common doesn't necessarily mean you still can't get enormous range out of them. Now, moving down to France, they do things entirely different. So instead of bone dry, they actually make naturally sweet ciders, and they do that using a method called keeving, which, to make a long process short, just means you effectively cut off all of the nutrition to the yeast so that they go to work on fermenting that cider and then eventually run out of food and die. And these tend to be very low ABV, typically in that like 3 to 3.5% range. But in spite of that, in spite of the being sweet, they are incredibly complex and beautiful. And for me, these are the peak of cider across the world. And they're incredibly food friendly as well. That sweetness can help counterbalance spicy food or highly acidic food very well and help bring an additional element to dishes that are lacking it. And, you can find these okay around the world. They're typically going to be sold in 750 milliliter bottles as opposed to cans or traditional bottles up in the UK. And these are almost exclusively made with bittersweet apples, ones that are high in tannin, but not necessarily going to have a high acidity. Now, in Spain, they go the opposite route. High acidity is everything. And these are going to be typically dry, but they also tend to have a very a natural fermentation that's going to bring a ton of complexity to play, including an acetic note, that vinegary note that you can find even in some beers like Flanders Reds that really just add one more layer of depth, but also makes them very aggressive and assertive if you're not ready for them. Nevertheless, they stand up very well, especially at things like seafood or pork. But you definitely typically are going to see these served, especially in Spain, in small servings. So over here, it'll typically be in 750 milliliter bottles or even in cans for American producers. But over in Spain, what they'll actually do is serve it in little glasses in one of two ways. In the Basque Country, they do what's called a choch, where they have these huge vats. They'll pull a nail on it and let it stream out, and you go ahead and stand in line and come around and catch it in your glass and then take your shot and either get back in line or go sit down. In Asturias, they do what's actually called throwing the cider, where you take the bottle and you hover it high over your head and you hold that glass down by your hip and you actually pour it from that distance. And what that does, other than look really cool if you do it right or be really embarrassing and hilarious for the rest of us if you do it wrong, is helps aerate the cider and introduces bubbles in a type of cider that typically doesn't have one. And that's the thing about cider. Cider can be carbonated. Not all cider is. It depends on if you're either forced carbing it or trying to retain that carbonation by doing it in a sealed container or just letting it effervesce out. And every place kind of has their own method of doing so. But here in America, we do it a little different. We like to do what we do with everything, and we do all of it all at once, and sometimes even do it well. So here in the U.S., cider was actually our predominant beverage alongside whiskey back in the colonial days and for a while afterwards, but went away due to prohibition and never really recovered up until about maybe the last 12 years or so. And now we make cider from all different apple varieties. You have ones that are predominantly cider apples, some that are half and half, some are predominantly culinary apples, and all quality points among that, and all price points, frankly. And they tend to be canned, although some of the more farm-based orchards will throw theirs in bottles, so treat it more like wine. But in typical American fashion, we also love to throw everything under the sun in there to the point it's almost hard to find a cider here in the States that is just apples. Instead, we've taken to throwing fruit in there, very similar to what we do with, kettled soured beer. And that's a very similar kind of concept, very refreshing. And a lot of those are going to be relatively simple, but also have an entire expressive range of flavors to keep them interested and let people who really love blood orange have a blood orange cider. That opens up options to people in addition to what just the apples can offer. And we do a little bit of everything, but that can also make it kind of tough to understand what you're going to get. So make sure you're talking to your wholesalers, make sure you're talking to your local cideries before making a purchase, make sure you know what kind of cider you're getting. But building a cider program in general, there is some dedicated cider glassware. You don't need it. Standard beer wine glassware is going to do you just fine. For some of those nicer single format bottles, those wine glassware works pretty well, but otherwise a typical beer tulip was going to serve you just as well. And unlike wine, where typically you're going to want to have a handful of reds, a handful of whites, a rosé, and a sparkling, you're only generally going to need one or two options to satisfy customer demand, because cider drinkers are accustomed to not necessarily having a huge array of options in most places. Now, one thing about the American consumers, they do tend to expect cider to be at least a little sweet, and they have no issue with all those additional flavorings and adjuncts. So don't hesitate to lean into that, even if it's not necessarily the ciders that I or most cider experts would necessarily lean towards ourselves. Pricing wise, here's where it gets a little tricky because cider is expensive to make. Apples aren't cheap in the kind of volume that you need to get the juice to make a cider. It is a relatively expensive seasonal product to make, but customers aren't willing to pay that. They're only really willing to pay in line with beer prices. So wherever your beer prices are going to stand, the best move in general is going to be to go ahead and keep your pricing on cider in line with that and use that when you're deciding your budgeting for buying those products yourself. Now, American ciders also typically have draft options. Now, that's not necessarily something that the old world cideries are going to have available. Something to keep in mind. You might need to treat those more like a wine, but you'll typically have the ability to have one or two cider lines on if you're selecting from American cideries, and you don't need much more, if that many. But keep that pricing in line with your beer as well. And in general, typical serving sizes are going to be very similar for beer because the ABV is very similar. The one exception being traditionally Spanish cider are going to be those smaller 2 to 4 ounce pours. But again, you're not likely to see those done here in the States anyhow. Even those are typically just going to be poured into a full glass. But moving on to spirits. Yeah, we got 14 minutes. We're doing great. Moving on to spirits. So spirits in general, just made by distilling a fermented alcoholic liquid. So whiskey is fermented beer and brandy is fermented wine. We'll get into some of the other varieties, but that is the basic idea of it. And what distillation means is you take advantage of the fact that alcohol and water have different boiling points. So you bring this product up to heat and allow the alcohol to boil off and float up and then condense, and that brings it back together as a liquid on the other side that is a much higher alcoholic concentration than what went in the first place. Whereas what was left is typically a more acidic, more watery, less alcoholic remnant. And you can do that a couple of times through. There's pot stills and column stills. We're not going to get into all that because that's not as important for what y'all are doing. But a lot of breweries are starting to get into distilling more and more. So I'm happy to talk about that offline if anyone's looking to make that jump. But typically that alcohol content's going to run between 40 and 90%. And that's actually usually a factor of how much it's diluted down after distillation. Usually it's being distilled to higher than that and then has water added back down to get it down to typically 40% ABV is where you're going to see the vast majority of them, though things like cask strengths or neutral alcohol are going to be at different strengths. And you even have some like shochu and soju that are going to be significantly less than that. They're also typically dry. All liquors, all spirits are going to be 100% dry. Sugar does not come out in that distillation process when they're first distilled, but you can back sweeten them in a variety of ways. And some are typically back sweetened, some are almost always back sweetened, including liqueurs. So any sort of liqueur, which tend to be these very sweet spirits that have had heavy added flavorings, mostly intended as a partial component in cocktails, not to be drunk on their own. Those are going to be significantly sweeter to offset some of the high alcohol, but also in particular any sort of bitter notes from whatever's being added into them. Now, the main categories of spirits, those are going to be vodka, tequila / mezcal, so agave-based spirits, whiskey, rum, gin. There's a million other varieties that are either some variation of these. Even gin's basically a variation of vodka, but these are the ones that make up the majority of the market. So let's talk about them a bit. First is going to be vodka. And vodka can be made from any base. It does not have to be made from potatoes. Most vodka is not made from potatoes, though some is. All vodka means is that you distill a spirit up to the highest possible level that you really can achieve with a standard distillation process before all the things inherent in reflux and the technical aspects get the best of it. And that's 95% or 96%, depending on if we're talking the US or the EU, that you have to get that alcohol content up to. And then typically they are just diluted down to 40%. And what all this means is that anytime someone's talking to you about a very characterful vodka with a very distinct taste, usually that means one of two things. It either means that that's marketing BS and you are overpaying for something that is just the same as something down market that's not making those claims, or it means that you are getting a pretty bad vodka. Because if you get ones that have too many of the heads or the tails, it's going to be some of those higher order alcohols or some of the cheesy, almost waxy aromas from the bottom of the distillation. Then they'll try to pass that off as character and flavor when really those aren't pleasant whatsoever. So in general, from vodka, you want it to be extraordinarily clean, and you want it to be something that has very little or no distinct flavor or aroma. But what this does make for is an incredibly quality and versatile base for any sort of cocktails, because it's not necessarily adding an enormous amount on its own. Now, agave-based spirits are actually made from fermenting, typically roasting or steaming, and then fermenting the juice from the heart of these big agave plants that grow throughout Central America. And, you see these if you've ever seen an agave plant. They're succulents. They look pretty distinctive, and inside the middle is this big core, almost looks like a giant pine cone. And most people are familiar with tequila. And the thing about tequila is it has to be from certain parts, at least in Mexico. It has to be certain parts of parts of Mexico are the only ones that are able to make it. And the thing about tequila is it has to be made from blue agave. And there's been this long marketing campaign about how blue agave is the only way that you should be making it. It's higher quality. This is the fine ingredient versus all the other agave plants. But the thing is, blue agave is not necessarily better or worse than any other agave for making agave-based spirits. It's just the one that is mandated for tequila in particular. And most tequila is going to be made in the area of Jalisco on the west coast of Mexico. Mezcal, on the other hand, is typically made in the Oaxaca region and a handful of other areas throughout Central and South Mexico, and is also agave-based spirit, but is made from other types of agave. The other big difference is typically tequila is going to be made in a smokeless method, so it's not going to be adding any additional smoke or roasty character to the agave when you're processing it, as opposed to mezcal, which typically will, sometimes very prominently, almost tasting more like scotch. It's also important to keep in mind that with tequila, up to 49% of the sugars that are used to produce the alcohol can actually come from non-agave sources. So even though tequila does have this refined mystique around it, there are a lot of really bad tequilas out there. And there's a lot of really good tequilas out there, and it's become increasingly difficult to tell the difference unless you're able to figure out exactly how they are made. Whereas with mezcal in general, any mezcal that you're going to buy is going to be of a pretty high quality. Whiskey is just made from fermented grains, so some sort of beer, but that's not necessarily just barley. That could be wheat, it could be rye, it could be corn, and there's two main kind of varieties of whiskey that you're going to find. The first is malt whiskey. This is more traditional whiskey that you're going to find in Scotland or Ireland. American single malts have been taking the world by storm lately, or at least I wish they would. Japanese whiskey tends to be in this style, as does Indian whiskey, which is also gaining a lot more credibility lately. And that is typically going to be a little drier and a little lighter, and is put into second use barrels, typically used American bourbon barrels, and to add color. All liquor is also colorless when it first comes off the still, and is often drank either by itself or used in a handful of different cocktails. And I love malt whiskey personally, and some of it is smoky, but not all of it needs to be. There's a misconception that all Scotch is smoky, and that's actually almost entirely just Scotch from an area called Islay. It's one small island that still traditionally peats their whiskey, gives it that iodine, almost band-aidy medicinal character to it. There are some Japanese whiskeys that also do the same, some of them very, very well. A lot of them are actually import the peat from Scotland. But the other type of whiskey is going to be bourbon, or American style whiskey. So bourbon Tennessee whiskey, which is almost identical to bourbon, other than it has a special filtering process it has to go through. Rye whiskey, which is just made with predominantly rye, but outside of that is very similar to bourbon, typically a little drier, a little more characterful. And all of these are made, or at least bourbon and Tennessee whiskey are made predominantly from corn. Bourbon does not have to be made in Kentucky, even though that's a common rumor. But then they're thrown into first use barrels that are deeply charred on the inside. And that adds an enormous amount of color, which is why they tend to be so dark, but also adds some of those vanilla and marshmallow and banana, especially bananas Foster kind of notes that you get out of bourbon and Tennessee whiskey. And then those barrels go on to the beer industry and, the Scotch industry and to a lesser extent, the wine industry. So bourbon in particular has been gaining a lot of steam over the years to the point where now it has become a huge and absolutely ravenous market, and kind of reminds me a lot of when people were waiting in line for the newest Imperial Stout releases 10 years ago in the beer industry. That's really where bourbon is at right now, and the people who collect them can get absolutely insane. But again, typically consumed by itself, but can be used in a handful of some fantastic cocktails. And it is a little on that sweeter side, and that can help bring some balance to bitter ingredients in particular that otherwise might overpower an entire cocktail. Now, bourbon drinkers and malt whiskey drinkers are very, very different. So you really need one of each of these behind your bar if you're running a liquor program, because they're not interchangeable for most people. You're going to have to pick up the pace. Rum, just made from distilled sugarcane juice or molasses, especially the Caribbean. Every island has their own variation. Some of them are very sweet. Some of them are going to be extremely dry. Some of them are more expressive than others. Some are basically just vodka with the serial numbers filed off. But they do tend to have a grassier, coconutty note to it. And here in the States, you'll often find what's called spiced rum, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's just rum with spices added, usually also color corrected to give it a nice golden color. Rum can be hard to sell, but is very versatile in cocktails, and that's where it sees the majority of its use. And then gin, which is just vodka with juniper and typically other botanicals as well. More traditional ones are going to use almost predominantly or exclusively juniper, whereas the more contemporary ones are going to play with that a lot more and get a lot more creative with the whole bouquet of different things that they can do, and throw almost anything aromatic under the sun that you can find into it. Now, cocktail basics, think of this very similar to the way you think about beer. What balances the sweetness in beer? The hops, the bitterness. What balances the sweetness inherent in wine? It's going to be the acidity and the tannins to a lesser extent. And the same thing goes for building cocktails. If you're building cocktails, it's all about balancing the sweet versus the bitter or the sour, and the strong ingredients, those highly alcoholic ones, versus the ones that are going to dilute it down to something more pleasant to drink. And that's what you got to keep in mind, is all about balance. Now, cocktails typically fall into 4 categories. Spirit forward ones are going to be something like a Negroni, where every component has alcohol to it. They tend to be very high alcohol, but also consumed in relatively small portions, usually have some sweet and bitter in there to help temper that alcohol a bit. Short sours are going to be ones that are still majority alcohol based, but are going to be intended to be consumed in relatively small quantities because of the fact that they are typically so acidic, but also very alcoholic. Long sours are going to be a little spritzier. These are going to be ones that, you might have soda water, might have something like Sprite added to it to really balance it out, dilute it down. You can consume an entire pint of them and still be getting roughly what you would get out of a strong beer. And then highball, which are going to be the same thing, but not necessarily acid forward. They're going to be more that bitter or sweet balance to it. So in general, with any cocktail program, don't try to reinvent the wheel. There's a million different ways that you can go with cocktails. Focus on the ones that people know and are likely to recognize and likely to order, and then iterate from there. Change one ingredient. You have a whole new cocktail, something unique. Change another ingredient. Now you're getting a little further and further afield. And it's amazing by taking some of those old reliables, what you're able to iterate on instead of trying to create something whole cloth. So building a spirits program, again, start simple. Pre-made cocktails and ingredients can really save you some time and some costs, so definitely give those some consideration when you're looking at your own spirits program. Just batching those for the ones that go pretty quickly. That allows you to build them in bulk, save time behind the bar, and in a lot of cases, go ahead and build in those well options. You can even find draft cocktails these days, some of which have amazing margins, depending on who you're buying from. Now, as far as glassware is concerned, this is one where you're going to need more different types of glasses even than beer. In general, I tell people tulip glasses are a great way to build a beer program. If you're trying to be minimalistic, you can't do that with spirits. So a rocks glass, little suckers. Highball glasses, going to be kind of the straight-sided pint glass style. A martini glass pictured here. And shot glasses, that's really going to be your bare minimum. That's what you need to have a successful bar program. You can go off the rails with every other type of Coop and Nick and Nora imaginable, imaginable, but that's really a good place to start. So for a minimalist bar, I've lists here of things that you're really going to want to have to stock. That way you can do the majority of common cocktails. But there's a lot of places that you can go from there, unique ingredients you can go from there. So just keep in mind that this is a very easy area to spiral out of control if you're not being careful about how much bar inventory you're keeping. But the nice thing about a liquor program is that the margins on liquor are fantastic and they last almost forever. So generally, your initial outlay when you're building that inventory is going to be by far your biggest cost. And after that, it is very, very modest. So calculate your COGS carefully, especially on mixed drinks. It's very easy for more expensive ingredients to walk away without you even realizing it, or for you to not realize just how much cost by the ounce is baked into an individual cocktail based on people customizing them. So make sure you use within your point of sale system, you're giving your team every opportunity that they have to really build those formulas and make sure that you're not going underwater on the drinks that you're sending out. And keep in mind that overpouring can be a problem, not just from a liability standpoint, but frankly, a lot of bartenders like to boost their tips by giving a little bit extra. And that's coming out of your pocket. And it's hard to track unless you have something like Margin Edge has a way that you can weigh individual bottles to track their depletion. So be very careful on that and watch that carefully. And when it comes to pricing your cocktails, roughly 5 times your ingredient cost is what you're going to be looking at. You're going to be looking at about 82% margin, 76% margin, somewhere in that like 75 to 85% margin zone, depending on what you're pouring is going to be what you're going to be pricing those forward on. And people have a pretty decent tolerance for higher priced cocktails as long as you have well options or cheap options also available. Other beverages we don't have time to get into today. The one big one I will point out is, well, first off, everything towards the bottom of this list, as awesome as they are and as much love as I have for a lot of them, opt into those if you have a story to tell. Opt into those if you think you have a dedicated audience for them. Opt into those if you're passionate about them. There's not huge markets for any of them. Now, the flip side is going to be right at the top there, the hot drinks, coffee and tea. Running a coffee program isn't going to be everybody's cup of tea, pun intended, but that really does add an entire different portion of your day that you're still going to be paying for that square footage of your space. And if you're not making a dime there, that's just sunk cost. So having a coffee program, extending your day and becoming a coffee shop in the morning, it might not work for you, but it might. And it's worth exploring because that's money that otherwise you might be leaving on the table. But with that in mind, my contact info, I love meeting people around the industry. Please don't hesitate to reach out over just about anything. You can also find me on Facebook's probably the place I'm most well known for. That's that @AleChaser, or hit me up by email. But thank you so much, everyone, for having me, and have an excellent day.